Hi, my name is Kevin, and I collect old irons, and with me is Eugene Katzman. And Gene, what brings you to this video?
I'm a blacksmith.
Most iron collectors, such as myself, collect cast iron, not wrought iron artifacts. Cast are irons that have dates, they have manufacturers' names, they have locations marked on the iron, and thus these can be easily fit into a larger history. Wrought irons, on the other hand, are quite different. They are individually made by a blacksmith working with an anvil and a hammer. Sad irons made by use of a forge is a complicated subject. The process changed considerably with time and equipment. The quality of the metal used changed as well with time. The blacksmith may have worked by himself in a small village or with other blacksmiths in a well-established foundry. Here is a tailor's iron, otherwise known as a goose iron. These are quite common. This one's rather simple. It's narrow, probably used for the seams of pants, for example. It has the number 10. It actually weighs more than 10 pounds, so we think this is an inventory or a product number. The base is cast. The handle, on the other hand, is wrought. It's made from a bar, it's been twisted a bit, and inserted into the base. Gene, how did the handle and base come together?
This is a wrought handle and a cast iron base. The base would have had holes cast in it for them to match with the handle. The blacksmith would have done is made this part separately, hot, with a tapered end on both sides, and then brought these together and hit it with a hammer here and here to drive the pointed or tapered part into the mating hole. When these were cooled subsequently, the handle and base would then have swaged or seized together, making a nice, easy attachment without a lot of expense.
So here are a couple of all wrought tailor irons. This particular type, this is very early, and they're quite common. I've had 3 or 4 over the course of time.
Okay, so this iron is actually a very, very old one. It's actually made of wrought iron or forged iron. You can tell because of the striations here on the metal and also here on the nose. So this iron was actually made of one piece of very likely trade irons. This is iron that would have come on ships in big bars about this size. A piece of this would have been tapered out, so this would have been thinned out and brought forward about this much, twisted, and then of course bent back on itself to form the handle. So this is actually one piece of metal. So this iron is also made of wrought iron. It is actually, you can actually see the striations here and here as well. However, the interesting part about this one is it's actually forge welded. So that this top piece, while also iron, is not part of the body, unlike the other one, which was one piece. Sort of dating, I think these probably would have been very early 1800s. This would have been, again, trade iron. This, it's possible, could have been made from iron already in the New World. It would have been a little bit more recent.
So these two are wrought flat irons. We talked about flat irons in our second video, and we showed one of these at that time. These are sometimes called slave irons, with the idea that this would be used to show that the slave was working. These are actually not slave irons. I think that the rattle here was used keeping in mind that the person doing the ironing at that time is also entertaining some children underfoot, so you can iron and you can do this as you need it. To my eye, these are pretty much the same.
In fact, these irons, to my eye, are actually somewhat different. While they do both have a rattle, this iron very clearly has much stronger striations here, indicating that it is a piece of wrought iron, possibly a piece from a ship, you know, the scrap iron if something were to break. The other thing that's interesting in this iron is that there are these divots here and here, indicating that this handle was made possibly separately or as a replacement, and then it was swaged, or there were 2 holes made, just as the previous iron, 2 holes made, and then this was all put in all hot, and then when quenched, these would seize together. This was then peened over in order to help hold the handle in place. By contrast, This iron, while also wrought, and again from probably a similar piece, actually has a handle that is forge welded. So here and here you can see the attachment point is actually quite different. So again, very likely this was done by a smith who has probably a little bit more in the way of a shop, or this was probably done by somebody in a kind of a more primitive or faster way. So this was clearly forge welded here.
Speculating that this one's maybe from the 1700s to the early 1800s, 1820s or so, and that this one is in the mid 1800s, maybe 1850s, 1860s. And can you say a bit about how the handle was made to put the rattle in place?
Absolutely. So in the case of this first one, the handle was made out of a flat stock or square bar stock, and which was flattened, and then a piece of metal was put in, and then this was rounded prior to being inserted into the body. This one was somewhat similar, although the fact that the flat stock here is a little bit heavier indicates that its metal was not quite as expensive as it was in the case of this iron, which I think plays well with the idea this is a little bit newer than this one.
So we have two more, by appearances, early-ish irons. These are what I would call sleeve irons. This one with a rounded back, and this one's got an unusual tapered both fore and aft kind of configuration. These are forge welded. On this one, the front forge is loosened out.
So these are actually not iron. Technically, they're steel. Although they are an older version of steel. And Kevin, you're correct. These are forge welded. Although the weld here has come off. You can actually see there's a gap. So the same with this one. This one's actually forge welded on both sides. So here and here. And so these are very likely repurposed steel. So something has broken off, or there's a scrap, and somebody needs an iron, and it's a nice, easy way for a blacksmith to make a product out of something that is basically in their scrap pile. So both of these were probably made that way. They were made quite quickly, but at the same time, there is good workmanship indicating that smiths still cared about what they were doing.
Any speculation on age?
Probably late 1800s for both of them. These are steel, but they're very clearly an earlier steel.
This is a very unusual iron I got recently, and it's all a single piece. It's apparently something that's been built up from scrap, and probably from a scrap piece of an I-beam, brought at the bottom. This has been shaped, and then a piece taken out from here to produce the handle. Tell me about this.
Certainly, Kevin. So this very clearly, as you have indicated, is in fact an I-beam. And if you look, this clearly has a cross-section like an I-beam. This would be the webbing. This would be the sort of the cross part of the eye. This is actually made out of cast iron, so gray iron, and it has been cut because cast iron is very easy to cut. And this has also been cut somewhat crudely with a file. Basically, a good indication of what we might think of as Yankee ingenuity to repurpose metal, which was at that time still very expensive. And
where might this piece have come from?
This probably came from a piece of bridge, like a railroad bridge. These kinds of bridges tended to fail somewhat spectacularly, and when they did, there's a lot of iron left over on the shore. And so, getting a small piece and shaping it into something useful is something I would expect people to have done back in the day.
This is a very large, very heavy piece. I bought this in Maryland some years ago, and it looks all wrought to me, but I understand that I might be wrong.
Well, actually, so you are correct that this is wrought, that is to say it was made by a blacksmith, but this portion, because of sort of the beady look to it, this is probably cast. And once again, as in previous irons, there would have been a couple of holes here that were a mating part to this, where this was then placed into the body when it was still hot, and then of course pounded to drive the two handles down in here. And then when this was all cooled together, these would have seized into one piece, and you can very clearly see that it is a very, very solid piece of equipment. So I think that's what it is a combination piece.
So Who would have made this? Was it been made in a small village blacksmith or something in a larger operation?
It probably would have been a larger operation simply because making these molds out of very likely green sand was a multi-person production, and village blacksmith couldn't have made money if they had to do all that work on their own. So this probably would have been a production line type of setup rather than an individual smith.
So a small foundry?
A small to medium foundry.
Okay. This is an interesting piece. I've seen a number of these things from Maine. We have no information on the provenance, but I'm guessing it might have been from a Maine or Massachusetts maker. It is plainly the base is cast. The handle is wrought with a back and forth motion for ornamental purposes. It has a tin shield and a wood handle, all of this integrated together. Can you tell us a little bit about the steps made in creating this?
So you are correct. This base was made as one piece, and it would have been either cast out of steel or may have been drop forged, which is sort of the next step in the technology. But the interesting thing is that it had two holes, and this is made of a soft material. The fact that there are two screws, which are a little bit tough to see in the video, they were probably harder material than this metal. And when this was all put together, these screws were basically used the way you would use screws in wood, and they would bite down into this softer metal to attach everything together. So this was clearly made, this is a sort of a concertina pattern. This was made by a blacksmith, and probably these were made in bulk because they're easy to make individually. The other interesting thing in here is that this bolt is actually handmade. And you can tell that because the square nut is a very early, very easy to make by hand contrivance, whereas modern nuts are hexagonal. So this was actually a handmade production, so to speak, bolt. That the threads were cut individually, and so was the nut. And then when this was all assembled, it was meant to last.
And my guess is mid-1800s. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense. It makes sense that it's actually mid to late 1800s. This was actually a transition piece to production. So from an individual blacksmith to a production shop, and the material uniformity says that it's probably more of an industrial process.
So now let's transition to two pieces made very much in a larger foundry. We actually know the foundry. The foundry is the Savory and Company foundry in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. They're well marked. This is 11 pounds, this is 18 pounds. On the cast bottoms, this one has a wrought bar, twisted handle, very typical of larger tailor irons, and this one has a somewhat different handle.
The smaller one here is in fact a cast or possibly drop forged bottom, although it's probably cast, and it does have a place for the handle. So as in previous irons, this handle was forged by a blacksmith, probably in bulk, and then again the end of these was tapered to match the mating hole in the base. And these were of course set when they were hot, and when this all cooled, it would have swaged or seized together, making a nice easy sort of and heavy piece. This one is actually a little bit more interesting in that this is easier to produce and probably would have been made faster. So this is very, very obviously cast, and it's cast with a ferrule in place. This is one piece that would also have been tapered, and this is very easy then for a blacksmith to make out of a piece of flat or round stock, and then simply place in the body when it's still hot, and striking just here, put it in the correct position. These would have been very easy to produce, and therefore probably would have been more amenable to a kind of a larger production facility.
Let me ask about the making now.
Sure.
In terms of holding this in place, would this have been clamps with a couple of people, or would this be one person simply with a glove and handle?
It actually would have been a single smith with a pair of tongs that they're about this far away, and they would have been able to grab this. This would have been hot. This would have been about red to orange, and it would have been brought into
And it was set into a little depression here.
That's right. There's a matching hole that probably goes down about that far into the base, and this would have been tapered or brought to a point, and then at the correct time, the smith would have put this here and just hit right down at the at the bend, and that would have driven this piece down in here, and then
How many pounds might that have taken?
um,
Depending on the hammer.
20 or 30.
That many, okay.
Yes, and a good smith would have been able to generate many times more pressure as needed.
So the early sat irons, single piece, as they may have been, iron is brittle, and with a lot of use, those handles broke off, and the blacksmith would come in and fix these. And these irons, us collectors in the antique shops, we see lots of these. We very seldom buy them, as we're looking at ones that have markings. I do have a couple here. Why don't you talk about these, if you will?
This one is actually one that caught my attention in your collection immediately, because this is actually a door latch. If you look carefully on the side, this is actually an example. I believe it's a Suffolk latch that's been modified, or just a door pull that's been modified and added onto the original iron, because clearly the original iron handle had broken off. And then what would have happened is that this would have been modified by a smith, placed over the stubs, and then they would have hit it with a ball peen hammer to peen or mushroom the ends out in order to get it to stay. And that is not a recent repair. That's actually very like early 1900s, or maybe a little bit earlier. This one is sort of interesting in that this is clearly old and has clearly seen a lot of use. However, this is modern steel. You can actually buy a flat bar stock like this, and it's got a very uniform hole in it. And what in this case had happened is that somebody had drilled a hole in the iron, because iron is soft, and they would have modified this, slotted that down into the hole, and in this case, as you can see, they actually probably brazed that together. That is to say, they got this up to heat, and they got some brass and some welding flux, and they would have melted the brass or some kind of tin perhaps down into the hole in order to get it to stay. And when this all cooled, it seized together.
Now, was this made to put this iron back into a condition that could be used, or is this actually made to recycle this into an antique shop?
This actually, to me, looks like it was put to use, because it feels very nice in the hand, and a blacksmith that would have been doing this for simply, for decoration would probably have done more kind of a more antique looking handle, because it is possible to do. This was clearly done reasonably quickly to put this back into use.
And when do you think this might have been done?
The restoration is reasonably modern. It's probably in the 50s or 40s, but the base was cast quite a bit earlier, probably in mid 1800s.
So there's a lot that I've personally learned in this dialogue that we've been having for some time. And one of them is that there were at one time a lot of blacksmiths, and probably every village blacksmith that you can think of spent a fair amount of time working on sat irons. Again, these are very commonly found in antique shops, not that we necessarily buy them very frequently. And how long have you been blacksmithing, Gene?
Over 20 years.
Have you ever made a sat iron?
Not yet.
Would you like to try here once the snow melts and we can get to your shop and see how it's done?
Absolutely.